Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Friday, July the 14th, 2023. I am sober. It's morning in California, but I'm not sure America is quite as sober as I am. America seems to be on a drug binge. We've done lots of shows about it. One with Calhoun, I guess we might call him a left libertarian when it comes to drugs. His book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, is a huge success. Interesting conversation with Dr. Hart. Another with a real doctor, Peter Grinspoon, recently on marijuana, Seeing Through the Smoke. A cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana. Another with Casey Schwartz on Adderall. I'm not sure if that is a drug that's supposed to get us high. It certainly catches, so to speak, our attention. Her book, Attention, a Love Story, is a love story, really, I guess, in some ways about drugs. And then also with William Brewer, we had a really interesting, revealing conversation about how psychedelic therapy, psychedelic drugs, saved his life. He has a novel out about it, I guess a kind of psychedelic novel, The Red Arrow. All of this adds up to a different kind of America. So does America reflect our drug binge, or does the drug binge reflect America? That's the question that my guest today, Benjamin Y. Fong, asks in an important and very intriguing new book written from the left, but in a 21st century way, not too ideological. Quick Fixes: Drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge. And Ben is joining us from his garden in Seattle. Ben, I hope you're as sober as I am.
I am indeed. It's 10 in the morning.
Good. Well, congratulations. So this 21st century binge of drugs, quick fixes, how would you summarize it? How would you explain it, Ben?
Sure. I think that Americans are taking a world historic amount of drugs today. I think the most familiar aspect of the drug binge today is the opioid crisis and its associated deaths of despair. But really, it's across the board. It's benzodiazepines, it's amphetamines, it's marijuana, it's antidepressants, antipsychotics. Really, across the board, Americans are using more drugs than ever. At the same time that we have this still going war on drugs with the largest prison system in the world. Full 1/5 of prisoners are in for non-violent drug offenses. So it's really this contradiction between America's intense love for and hatred of drugs that I wanted to make sense of in the book.
You're writing from the left, Ben, no ambiguity about the book is published by Verso, the most credible and interesting of left-wing publishing companies. You mentioned the opioid crisis and I guess the white working class. We've done a number of shows about that. How would you fit the opioid crisis into a class analysis of America in the 2020s, particularly the way in which it seems to have affected the white working class, and of course its implications for white populism and our current Trumpian moment?
Sure. The opioid crisis you could think of as the product of two factors. One was a lax regulatory environment where one particular company, the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma, was responsible for irresponsibly pushing opioid medications that hooked a lot of people. They had irresponsible advertising around their primary drug, OxyContin. But really, you could think of this as a broader problem of pharmaceutical regulations or the lack thereof. Kathleen Friedel, the historian, has called it the pharma cartel. in recognition of the fact that it wasn't just Purdue Pharma, that there was a lot of different pharmaceutical companies were cashing in on opioid medications at a time when regulations were lax, and when the traditional practices around opioids had also changed dramatically with the rise of palliative care and other sort of changes within the medical field. So that was one part. I think very aggressive pharmaceutical industry pushing opioids. I think the other part is just that America has a uniquely awful healthcare system. And in the absence of a real healthcare system and the various sort of predations of profit that are allowed therein, you get people turning to pills in ever greater numbers, and they're very effective medications at numbing pain. They're not so effective at working through that pain in more productive ways. So,
what about the racial politics, though? If the opioid crisis was affecting African Americans more than white Americans, I think the left would be more invested in it. Is there a certain kind of irony in the way in which early 21st century American capitalism has come to haunt and in some ways destroy the white working class, who have always thrown in their lot with it?
I think the left is concerned with the opioid crisis. It's a major crisis in American society. I think that the reason that it affected the white working class in particular is the particular geography that the opioid crisis hit. So the sort of famous pill mills that were covered in Sam Quinones's Dreamland, those were in the Rust Belt, in sort of dilapidated towns like all over Ohio. And after the pill mills shuttered, it was Mexican heroin dealers that went to these towns precisely because they wanted to avoid more violent and already occupied urban areas where drugs were being distributed. And so I think the particular geography of the opioid crisis in the 21st century explains a lot of why the white working class was targeted.
And also, I guess, Ben, in a sense, American capitalism, neoliberalism or post-neoliberalism has caught up with the white working class.
Absolutely. If there's a defining feature of the neoliberal period since the 70s, it's deindustrialization. It's the gutting of the core industries, rubber, auto, steel, that used to prop up, the working class in its entry into the middle class. Deindustrialization was devastating. It was economically devastating, but it was morally devastating as well. And I think you could see the opioid pill boom as filling in where good jobs ought to be.
I want to come back to this, and I want to make sense of it in the context of white populism in America. But your book, I think it's an important book. Quick Fixes, Drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge, in good Versoist leftist tradition, historicizes this. So you begin with the prohibition. This is the first period that you analyze in terms of quick fixes. Tell us about the politics of prohibition and how it came that one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced industrial country of the early 20th century banned alcohol for almost 20 years.
Yeah, it should be a fairly shocking fact that in the United States, a country that's historically absolutely loved alcohol, that for a good 13 years it was totally prohibited. There were European temperance movements, and there were limited experiments in Europe with prohibition, but it never took off in the same way. So I think that there's something to be explained there. And in the book, what I want to say is that there was no development of a real countervailing political force in the United States as you got in Europe. So you didn't get powerful workers' parties and organizations that allowed some channel for pushing back against the social ills that followed from industrialization. And so in the absence, you got a primarily moral response. And that's what I want to say really gave the temperance causes their moral force, because there were no structural solutions to the problems of capitalist society, because there wasn't a real countervailing political force that was coalescing. Reformers targeted the social ills that followed from industrialization with a primarily moral response.
So in a sense, yeah, it's a really important point. Instead of the German Social Democratic Party or Rosa Luxemburg, America got William Jennings Bryan, who ran unsuccessfully for president 3 times in the Democratic Party, the hero on the left at the beginning of the 20th century, and a man very much associated with prohibition. Tell us about Bryan and why he speaks to this what you call the privatization of morality amongst progressive Americans at the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century.
Well, I can't speak too much to Bryan. He doesn't really feature in the book. I mean, I can say that...
but he's important in the narrative, isn't he?
Oh, I mean, of course, maybe... yeah. I mean, the progressives sort of more generally are important in the narrative insofar as they saw very clearly the social ills that followed from capitalism while having a kind of confused response. So it wasn't all bad. I mean, I talk a lot about the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the book. And in many ways, this was the groundwork for women's suffrage in America. On the other hand, they were very confused in their politics. It was a primarily middle class organization, and they mixed some very good political proposals with a lot of sort of overly moralized rhetoric. And so the response tended to be more confused in a way that it wasn't when it was carried out by strong workers' organizations, as in Europe.
And what about the role of women? Women dominated the prohibition movement. I mean, my understanding, and please correct me, Ben, if I'm wrong, a lot of women were strongly in favor of prohibition because their drunk husbands or boyfriends would come home and abuse them. To what extent should prohibition be seen as, in some ways, the beginning of a viable political feminism in America?
Oh, it very much was, and the experiences in fighting for prohibition were taken up in the fight for suffrage as well. There was a class element there as well. I think that if there's a target of the national temperance movements that developed in post-antebellum America, it was the profligate male immigrant drunk who went to the local saloon, and this was a fairly new phenomenon with post-Civil War urbanization. You got much more visible drinking in urban spaces, and it was primarily men who would visit the saloons. They were predominantly male establishments, and they would get very drunk in their limited time off. And it was their wives that were concerned about the drinking, but it was the WCTU is primarily a middle class organization. It was middle class women looking on lower class men and finding them morally reprehensible. So I think there's
it's Hillary Clinton. What did Hillary Clinton say about these people?
Well, she said a lot of different things.
Yeah, but what was the famous one? What did she describe them as?
Are you talking in the realm of drugs now?
Oh, well, not drugs, just general behavior. What did she call them? Not the Republic.
Well, the reprehensible.
Yeah, the reprehensible. So it's still that upper class or upper middle class white female distaste for working class men.
Yes, that was very much pervasive in the WCTU.
Hillary would have been a prohibitionist, wouldn't she?
I can speculate about that.
I mean, not that we can speak on behalf of Hillary Clinton. Only she can do that, and she's always welcome to come on the show, of course. What's interesting also about the prohibition, this is one thing I never really understood, Ben, maybe you could explain it. It divided Republicans and capitalists. I mean, the wealthy capitalists in New York City, for example, they weren't in favor of prohibition. How would you make sense of the relationship between capitalism and prohibition, especially in its impact on important industries like the alcohol industry?
They were for a while. I mean, Rockefeller, Ford, William Randolph Hearst, there was a good segment of the capitalist class that was very much for prohibition, in a limited sense, I should say. And I think that at root that has to do with the fact that, I mean, there were a lot of different factors that played into the movement for prohibition. It's one of the reasons it was successful, because it formed a coalition of so many different disparate groups. But I would say the key thing there is that there was a really palpable concern with the issue of worker discipline in a new mechanized age. Right? When you sent workers out into the field, if they were high or drunk, it didn't really matter that much. But if you send a drunk worker into a complex production process in a factory, things could go really wrong. And so there was this new modern concern with like how workers ought to behave in these new settings. And I think that's why a strong portion of the capitalist class, despite their own personal feelings about alcohol, many were abstainers, but many thought the prohibition cause was ridiculous. Despite their personal feelings, they were supportive of it at first. Now, midway through prohibition, they turned on the dry cause, and it's because they turned on it that gave impetus to its repeal. But at first, they were very supportive of it.
It seems to me, Ben, that prohibition is an American thing, in the sense that Americans could have their moral cake and also have their drinks. Everyone was morally outraged one way or the other by prohibition, and America went on drinking. If anything, under prohibition, America seems to have drunk more than pre-prohibition. So there's something uniquely American about the kabuki quality of prohibition, that it never really existed. It was something that people pretended existed but didn't really.
Yeah, I mean, there were very comical workarounds. Some companies would sell grape fermentation kits.
That's the beginning of the wine business too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was comical in one way, and especially in urban centers, you can get all sorts of funny stories during Prohibition about different ways in which people basically just flouted the law. There was that aspect to it. I should also say, though, that there was a more insidious aspect. The historian Lisa McGurr has recently covered this in a book called The War on Alcohol. And as comical as prohibition was in places like New York City, in other areas, it was in many ways the beginning of the war on drugs. It was a new way in which vigilante groups would demonize minorities. It was a way in which new policing apparatuses sort of like got their start. In many ways, the Prohibition Bureau paved the way for the Bureau of Narcotics after Prohibition was repealed. So there's a more insidious part.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you've read Beverly Gage's book on J. Edgar Hoover, but certainly Hoover's beginning was in the Prohibition, and the beginnings, the origins of the FBI, and of course the racial element. The KKK was outspokenly in favor of Prohibition. Let's move on to the second stage, which you describe as a Fordist Keynesian period in the narrative of American quick fixes. What changed in the 1930s post-prohibition? Of course, FDR, in the stroke of his pen, ended prohibition in 1932 or 3 when he was elected president.
Yeah, I think the key development there is that in ending prohibition, he also inaugurated the New Deal, which actually put the United States on the course for the kind of prosperity that temperance reformers were promising. And in that new era, which was building a new kind of consumer society, the old moral paternalism of prohibition, it really didn't find a target anymore. It didn't find a home. And so the temperance movement sort of lived on, but no one took it quite as seriously. And in its absence, and with the new imperatives of the consumer society, it was a time of pretty outrageous drug use. I mean, this was the peak of cigarette and coffee consumption in the United States, but a wide range of drugs, amphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, were all legal substances. And not only that, but they were really easy to get. They were practically adult candy in the post-war period. And in the book, I want to argue that Part of that reason was the war. All these drugs were available to soldiers during the Second
You
World
mean
War.
after the First World War, not the Second World War?
No, the second.
Okay.
So in the Second World War, soldiers came home 45 and had gotten used to having these different drugs, amphetamines in particular. And so there wasn't really a culture of seeing much danger around these things. And so they were sometimes available by prescription, but even as late as 1965, you could get a methamphetamine inhaler over the counter in the United States.
So let's then, so we have the New Deal. Are you, like many people on the left, Ben, are you nostalgic for that second stage, that Fordist Keynesian moment, the New Deal? Or do you believe that we can go back to it? Or does history, as Marx teaches us, move forward inevitably and unavoidably?
I think that there's a kind of productive nostalgia that can be had for the New Deal. They did a lot of things right.
Especially after a couple of drinks, right?
in the labor upsurge of the 30s, there's a lot to learn from there. We can't go back, we can't recreate the old structures, but we should also learn from them. And I think that there's a lot to learn from in the 30s. It really set the United States on a kind of path dependency during the war that led to a post-war prosperity in which the working classes broadly shared.
What happened, Ben, to the tradition of William Jennings Bryan, that sort of agrarian idealism, I guess, a Protestantism of the left after Prohibition? Did these people remain secret prohibitionists, or did they join the party, so to speak?
Well, I think the Depression really reset a lot of things in the United States. It reset politics, it reset the labor movement, and it lost its moral force, I think, in a lot of ways. People who once thought of it as making sense within the United States, who once sort of occupied a certain moral universe with the various crises of the Great Depression, it just didn't have an anchor anymore in American society. And I think that people were, from a lot of different classes in American society, were very willing to try out radically new things and to dispense with the old ideas.
What about in the context of the Cold War, Ben? The Soviet Union was puritanically opposed to drug use of one kind or another. And of course, I think in some ways it was alcohol that eventually brought it down. How would you compare and contrast drugs in America and drugs in the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century?
I can't say I know that much about drug use in the Soviet Union other than alcohol use. I don't think that any country even closely matches the United States drug consumption in the post-war period. I don't think it's particularly close. Part of that has to do with the fact that the Second World War made very clear to people in government that controlling international drug flows was going to be a top priority. And so it was a very aggressive campaign. There's a book by the historian Susanna Rice called "We Sell Drugs." It's all about this period, and both illicit and illicit markets were kind of cornered by the United States. And so, in terms of like overall drug use, not just alcohol use, but drug use, the United States, blows away all other countries during the period.
Yeah, it, as you say, literally blows it away.
Yeah.
So this third stage, and from the left perspective, this is the bad stage. We have what you call neoliberalism. Is this sort of connected also with Vietnam? You mentioned global drug use. Troops, I didn't actually know that troops brought drugs back or drug use back from the Second World War. Of course, Vietnam is famously associated with American drug use. How is the history of neoliberalism in America from, I guess, the 60s or late 60s, 70s onwards, and drugs in America, how are they connected?
So people generally see the neoliberal period as inaugurating in the early 1970s. And quite conveniently, this was the time when new drug legislation was taking hold. In 1970, there was the Controlled Substances Act, which created the modern drug scheduling system that's still with us today. And it was the beginning of what I call in the book, the acute phase of the war on drugs. The war on drugs had been going on basically since the beginning of the 20th century, but Nixon really inaugurated its acute phase. And as you said, returning Vietnam vets was very much they were very much in his crosshairs. There was a huge concern at the time that that soldiers in Vietnam who were using opium and heroin, that they would come back to the United States and cause this new drug scourge. That didn't really happen, demonstrating, I think, that drug use is very much influenced by situational contexts. But there were other things that Nixon and company were concerned with. His domestic affairs advisors, John Ehrlichman, said, we wanted to control black people, we wanted to control the new
right.
left.
So when Nixon used the word drug, I mean, he's famously associated with dog whistle language and politics. When Richard Nixon said drugs, was he really talking about black Americans, do you think, in his mind, or certainly in the messages he was giving?
Well, according to Ehrlichman, who offers this remarkable admission, he said, we were trying to target black people in the new left, and we tried to associate both with drugs, and by demonizing drugs, we could control those populations. And so I think that he definitely had his political enemies in mind. I want to argue in the book, though, more generally, that basically anytime someone talks about controlling drugs, they're actually talking about controlling people. That it's the populations associated with the kinds of drug use that they're describing that are the problem, and not necessarily the drugs.
What about the left and drug use? I'm thinking of Ginsberg, of course, and the psychedelic movement of the 50s, and then the embrace of the left, or certainly the counterculture of drug use in the 1960s. How do you make sense of the way in which the left did or didn't embrace drug use in this neoliberal period?
I think it was something of a disaster, in perfect honesty. I think that a lot of the bad tendencies on the left were inaugurated during this period, and I can't see it as unconnected to the drug use of the time. I mean, the kinds of insurrectionary fantasies that a lot of new left groups took on, it's hard to divorce that from widespread drug use. So I don't see it as a particularly salutary development in the history of the left, and I think in a lot of ways it put the left on a very much on a path of marginalization that we're still sort of working through today.
It was a left libertarianism. Are you, in a way, reviving a more puritanical tradition on the left of William Jennings Bryan? Are you suggesting that drugs, so to speak, when we're thinking of seeing through the smoke, stops us seeing the nature of things, that drugs takes people's minds off class struggle or capitalism or power, or all the things that interest you?
No, I hope not. I mean, I'm definitely not interested in reviving some kind of neo-prohibitionism. I think that that Americans have been dealing with that strand of the treatment of drugs for well over a century. And, it's not only proven a failure on its own terms, but it's borne all sorts of pernicious consequences. At the same time, as you say, I'm skeptical of new decriminalization and legalization movements. I don't think that they take seriously the sort of pathological forms of drug use in contemporary.
So you wouldn't be a fan, for example, of Karl Hart's work and his arguments?
There's a lot that I agree with in Dr. Hart's work. There's a lot there that I think is right. I mean, and in general, the key reforms or the key proposals of liberal drug reformism, including reforming laws around mandatory minimums, legalizing marijuana, different reforms around policing. I think that they're all good demands. I do think, however, that there are broader structural problems of American society. And until you tackle those, you're not going to tackle the issues associated with drugs. And in the conclusion, I focus in particular on jobs and healthcare, that if Americans had better paying, meaningful jobs, and if they had a healthcare system that actually functioned, a lot of the problems we associate with drug use would go away. And in fact, it would provide us with what I say is a free relationship to drugs, right? We should seek a world where people use drugs not because they're coping with the structures of American society, but because they actually want to take drugs and see what they can do with them.
So this our current stage is the post-neoliberal stage. We've done lots of shows about it. What comes after neoliberalism? No one's come up with a term.
Yeah.
But it is our age of anxiety, our age of isolation, of atomization. Do you think that America's current drug binge and our Americans' general addiction to one kind of drug or another, from psychedelics to Adderall to marijuana, that's a reflection of this post-neoliberal world?
I think it's really hard not to see it as a reflection of the numerous crises we're going through right now. As you say, there's no term for what comes after neoliberalism, and that's because we don't know what comes after neoliberalism. We're in this period of transition, and in it, the drug use has been normalized in new ways, as it was in some ways during the post-war period. So we get legalization movements in marijuana and psychedelics, and as I said at the beginning, it's a moment of fabulous drug use. And yeah, I mean, just more generally, it's difficult to see all of these trends as unconnected to the current moment of anxiety and uncertainty.
You call it psychopharmacology. It's a very interesting take, and I wonder what the tech piece of this is. Mark Zuckerberg has made a multi-billion-dollar bet on the metaverse as an alternative reality. It seems as if increasingly there's less and less of a distinction between humans and machines. How does this play out in our techno-fixated world, Ben? Are you fearful that the binge will eventually turn us into machines, and in an odd sort of psychedelic or surreal way, we'll return to the Fordism of the early 20th century, only as machines rather than as human beings?
I'll get to the first part of the question first. The oddness of the moment is captured in stories about Elon Musk taking ketamine or Peter Thiel cornering synthetic psilocybin patents. The ruling class has a real fascination with drugs at the present moment, and I think if there's a reason to both hold off a renewed drug prohibitionism at the same time as we're skeptical of new legalization movements, it's that Silicon Valley is very invested in these new legalization and decriminalization movements. That being said, I don't think that they're going to deliver what many people promise they will. Drugs are a great way of numbing the pain of disconnection, but they're not going to replace basic human realities. And there's this constant fear. You get this in various dystopian science fiction movies about how people are going to be drugged into becoming machines, or just everyone's going to exist in their own tub of butter using their special cocktail of drugs. I think that drugs are very efficient at doing the things they do. I don't think that they're going to ever solve human problems in either a authoritarian way or a democratic way, and that those problems take actual work. They take communication. They take working with other people, and drugs are a fun distraction sometimes from that work, but they're not going to. They don't pose that kind of danger to the problems of human society.
One of the really interesting stories these days, Ben, and I'm sure you've given some thought to it, is the appearance of these new, that they're not really drugs conventionally, but these drugs supposed to control the body and appetite and enable Americans to lose weight. Americans, of course,
Yeah.
being the most obese people in the world. Now there's research suggesting that some of these medicines are actually might encourage suicide. How does this fit in to your narrative?
Yeah, it's a constant promise of the drug industry to deliver us some drugs that's going to solve a problem like weight loss that a lot of people are concerned with. The story of the amphetamines is really bound up in this. I mean, when amphetamines were first put on the market in the 1930s, they were put on as mood enhancers, but they were mulling different possibilities, and weight loss was one of them. Amphetamines do help you lose weight. And really, since then, there haven't been great developments in that market. Amphetamines are kind of still the best drugs for that purpose. But I think, as everyone also knows, they also have very detrimental effects if you take them quite regularly. So it's one of those constant promises that the drug industry wants to bait us with.
Ben, has anything really changed? Thinking of Huxley's Brave New World, his dystopia of the 1930s, dominated by Soma. Is anything that different in 100 years since Huxley wrote Brave New World?
There's another Huxley book called Island, I think it is, where he imagines much the same scenario from Brave New World, but actually thinks of it as a good thing, as drugs as propping up new forms of human subjectivity. So there's two sides to that, and I think that sort of schizoid alternation between real fears around drug use and ideas that drug use can be liberatory in new ways, that has been constant in American society for well over 100 years. I think it's taken different forms in the different periods we've talked about. So in one way, it's cycled between demonization and normalization. So demonization with industrialization, normalization in the post-war period, demonization with neoliberalism, and then a new period of normalization today. But various things have happened in the interim, and I think that the kinds of overlapping crises that American society is experiencing today, it's difficult to know sort of what comes next. And so I would say at the same time that we're dealing with the same problems as ever, that the particular crises that we're encountering today and the new legalization and decriminalization movements that have attended them, it's a novel situation, and I'm hesitant to make predictions with it.
Ben, finally, you've danced around the prohibition left issue, but I wonder, as progressives look for ideas that are popular, if not populist, what's wrong with prohibition if it's articulated correctly? As you suggest, people need to see through the smoke of early 21st century capitalism. Why shouldn't we return to William Jennings Bryan in his concern with the fate of human beings? Especially, Biden obviously is a kind of manifestation of the stultification of the left in America. Couldn't this be dressed up in a healthy way, moving away from the left libertarianism, which, as you suggest, is a cul-de-sac ideologically?
I definitely don't think that the left should cede the social critique wholly to the right, and I think that that's been a historic mistake to not see increasing drug use across the board as in some way pointing to real social issues that we should be dealing with. And so, in that sense, I'm not a left libertarian. At the same time, I don't think there's much future in reviving prohibitionism because no one really likes it, and especially since the rise of consumer society, that kind of direct moral paternalism, I think, has pretty limited political import. I don't think people are attracted to that on a broad scale, and so I don't think there's anything to revive there. I mean, as I said again, the book is not against contemporary drug use. The book is against that use within the context of American society and the kinds of imperatives that spur that drug use. And so I would say that what we need today is not a new prohibition. What we need today is not a new kind of drug peddling. What we need is a freer relationship to drugs so that we don't have to feel the same compulsions to use them or the compulsions to prohibit